Welcome back to the France 24 Newsroom. The press conference just beginning on the closing day of the Paris Finance and Climate Summit. Let's listen in.
For what has been dubbed as the How Dare You Summit. And for sure, I think we have confronted financial orthodoxy. We have confronted shareholder power, global capitalism, and corporate power. And we have also had a conversation about big oil. Madame Laurence Tobiana spoke about breaking taboos. Prime Minister Mia Mottley reminded us that this is not a formal decision-making forum, but a pivotal moment to set aside our national interest and end the perpetual blame game. I want to repeat here again, as I did before, this is not about North versus South. It is not about emitters or non-emitters. It's not about the rich versus poor, climate guilty or innocent, and the powerful or the powerless. It's about all of us, big and small. It's about us in our diversity. And it's about crafting a win-win outcome. These are the benchmarks we have established for ourselves. They will serve us as a criteria against which we must assess our agreement. We have agreed that no country should be forced to choose between eradicating poverty and preserving the climate. We have agreed on some additional resources to support the vulnerable and the poorer countries. We have advanced discussion on reforming the governance of the multilateral development banks. We have progressed the conversation on a new global source for financing for climate and the mechanisms that can be put together to insulate us from national interest and global power structure whose decision-making processes include all of us and not just a few shareholders. We are agreeing that for the first time, as we leave Paris, President Macron, and you have been incredible. You have run this like Kenyans should do. You have run it like a marathon. And, just to mention that we have agreed that we have to rethink. We are in a new normal. The new normal that came through the pandemic, into the Ukraine-Russia war, into the vagaries and what climate change is doing to us. Floods, cyclones, droughts, and the threat to humanity that we see. This new normal requires a new approach. We're all clear that up to 52 countries are facing debt distress. I listened to my sister, Kristalina. And you know, Kristalina, we have a wonderful relationship. You have been immensely supportive of Kenya. But looking at this context and listening to the discussion about the SDR, the allocation, the reallocation, the application, the verification, the assessment, the next, I get a headache. Honestly. I mean, I sincerely think that there is a much more creative way of dealing with this. The same way we did it during COVID. There is a way we can do this so that those in distress, the 52 countries to start with, how do we make it possible for them, since they are already assessed for the debts they owe? How do we make them enjoy the benefit of a pause or reschedule or whatever you want to call it, so that they can have immediate liquidity and create space for themselves? That is a conversation that I think we should have. And let me say, this will move us closer to addressing the crisis that we have today on matters liquidity. We have also had a conversation and progressed one on a new global sources of financing for climate action and mechanisms that can be better insulated from national interest. This will move us close to addressing the climate crisis as a global common good, as opposed to something that we have to play a balancing act with the national interest on one end and do this at scale. So they can do this at scale, urgency, and as if our existence depend on it. Let me clarify. Emmanuel, you've been immensely, speaking to you as a member of the G7, you have been immensely accommodative of all the divergent views that have come on the floor and in all the fora that we have enjoyed ourselves here. We are saying we want this time round a mechanism that involves everybody, where we are all paying, where we are all involved, and where we all decide. Because climate change is not about the North or the South. It's about all of us. And the discussion about carbon tax is a discussion that is a must-have. And on this one, we do not want the North to pay for the South. We want all of us to pay. Whether it is aviation tax, whether it is fuel tax, whether it is shipping tax, we want to pay because we want to be on the table. The conversation about who has not paid what is very energy sapping. It is very tiring. We want to have a different conversation. And I am very happy that that conversation has begun in Paris. And thank you, President Macron, for making it possible for this conversation to happen. Finally, have we been successful? The ultimate judgment of our success does not rest in our hands. In the coming days, the world will pass the verdict on us. But I must say, being part of this conference, we have made tremendous progress. Mm-hmm. I would have preferred to see a firm commitment building on the G20 debt suspension initiative to deploy a portion of the new development finance sought to provide greater fiscal space for heavily indebted countries by refinancing their maturing debts on more favorable and extended terms. Many of our countries lack the necessary fiscal room to make or to take on additional debt. And we're saying this, as we discuss this new financing system, we value the incredible support by the multilateral development institutions, World Bank and IMF. We also have a wonderful relationship with China. They finance our infrastructure development. The tension between the West and China is unhelpful, is unnecessary, and is as useless as the tension between the North and South when we discuss climate change. That is not necessary. We must find the formula that will bring all our financing to respond to three issues: urgency, scale, and to make it much more affordable. That is the conversation that we want to have, and hopefully we have laid the seeds of that conversation to happen. Again, thank you, President Macron, for making it possible for China to sit here and for the West to sit here, and those of us from the African continent to be in the equation. We don't take it for granted. Let me conclude this by saying we have some time between now and the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi between the 4th and the 6th of September. That is co-hosted by the Africa Union, and I was told by the chairman of the Africa Union who was here with us, the Africa Union Commission, to invite none other than President Macron. You will be a keynote speaker. We want you to carry the gains we have made here to Nairobi, onward to UN General Assembly, and finally to COP28. The progress that has been made here is immense. Let me tell you, President Macron, I know you said yourself that there is some work to be done. Yes, there is some work to be done. But we have plenty of time between now and Nairobi. We have like 3 months. As I told you yesterday, the UN Charter was negotiated in 2 months. I also said that the Bretton Woods institution where Kristalina and Ajay are working, they were negotiated in a little village, a little town called Bretton Woods in 1945, in 3 weeks. We have a lot of time between here and Nairobi, and between Nairobi and COP28. We can fix this, and it can happen for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Ruto. Thank you, President. I will now give the floor to Secretary Yellen. Chère Janet.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me begin by thanking you and the French delegation for hosting this summit and for your tremendous hospitality. This summit is an important milestone in our effort to evolve the global financial architecture to be more responsive to the tremendous challenges and opportunities facing us. And the last 2 days have made me optimistic about the progress we've made so far and the momentum that I believe can carry us forward in the coming months. I'd like to touch on our progress in 3 areas that I've focused on during my time here at this summit. First, our initiative to evolve the multilateral development banks, or MDBs. Global challenges like climate, pandemics, and fragility and conflict are putting development gains at risk. That's why I called for the evolution of the development banks last fall to tackle these global challenges with sufficient speed and scale. Our goal is to strengthen the MDB's work on eradicating poverty and supporting sustainable growth, their traditional goals, not distract from them. We've made significant progress on the MDB Evolution Initiative with a broad coalition of shareholders. And our coalition has made preliminary updates to the World Bank's mission and its operating model. We're unlocking as much as $50 billion in additional lending capacity over the next decade. And our estimate is that the MDBs as a whole system could unlock $200 billion in new lending capacity over the same time frame, and that's through balance sheet measures that are either already under implementation or being deliberated. Now, that by itself would be a very significant achievement. We could have $200 billion in lending capacity that we didn't have before to invest in some of the most pressing problems facing the world: combating climate change, lifting people out of poverty, preparing for future epidemics, and much more. But the evolution is not just about the balance sheet. It's about making sure we use these resources in a more impactful manner. So we're pushing for additional reforms on a rolling basis. And this includes work to optimize our climate finance architecture. Second, let me turn to debt and macroeconomic stability. The IMF plays an important role in providing policy advice and technical assistance along with critical financing. We've had constructive discussions about ensuring that the IMF can continue to provide concessional lending now and in the longer term. And we call on the IMF to present all available options to put its poverty reduction and growth facility on a sustainable footing in the near term by the annual meetings. And we also call for a broad range of donors to meet the IMF's financing targets for the trust. Now, we also need to complete outstanding debt cases. Debt is a global challenge, and it requires urgent cooperation from all creditors. To that end, I'm pleased that all official bilateral creditors have reached consensus to move forward with the debt treatment for Zambia under the leadership of the Chinese and French co-chairs. And I just saw Premier Li at the high-level panel, and I'm encouraged that China is moving to help address the debt challenges facing developing countries. Beyond resolving outstanding cases, a productive first step to provide greater certainty and timeliness to the debt process would be the publication of a guide to the common framework for borrowers. Third concerns private capital mobilization. As we announced earlier this morning, the Investor Leadership Network, which includes companies with a total of over $10 trillion in assets under management, has launched a new commitment to accelerate pension fund and institutional investments in emerging and developing economies over the next 3 years. And the United States will work closely with them to facilitate investments in the critical areas of energy transition and sustainable infrastructure. I also continue to believe that MDBs should launch a set of more innovative tools to boost private capital mobilization. And that is a priority shared by many leaders of these institutions, like President Bonga. We've already taken significant complementary action. Through the G7, we seek to mobilize $600 billion for high-quality infrastructure investment through the public and private funds over 5 years. And the United States has already achieved $30 billion of its $200 billion commitment. And through initiatives like the JETPs, or Just Energy Transition Partnerships, we're bringing public and private sources of funding together to provide tens of billions of dollars to fight climate change and spur economic development in emerging economies. Well, the challenge to the world that has brought us here to Paris is to make sure the global financial architecture can orient the necessary finance toward the essential tasks of eradicating poverty, combating climate change, and building a global economy that allows people and the planet to thrive. There's a great deal of work to do, and I look forward to working with the leaders on this stage and many more to advance our shared efforts. Thank you again, Mr. President, for your leadership.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Secretary Yellen. And now I will give the floor to Kristalina Georgieva for the IMF. Merci beaucoup, Kristalina, une fois encore d'être à Paris.
Thank you very much, Kristalina, for being here
Merci,
in Paris
Monsieur le
with us.
Président.
Thank you very much.
We had a very engaged and frank discussion, and it is so very important that we did. Our world is changing rapidly. It is affected by more frequent and severe shocks, and it is a world with more tensions than we need at this time. We need each other the most today. Our economy has proven resilient despite of the shocks we experienced, COVID, the war. But it hasn't been without a cost. Interest rates are up, debt burdens are rising, the cost of living is high, poverty and inequality are increasing, and the consequences of the climate crisis are upon us, and they hit the hardest poor people and poor vulnerable countries that have done the least to cause this problem. So it is time to step up. It is time for leadership. And President Macron, President Ruto, Secretary Yellen, my dear brother Ajay, we have to live up to the expectations that are put on us. I want to talk about 3 topics that are directly relevant to our work in the IMF that have been high on the agenda in these 2 days. First, debt. I completely agree with President Ruto that it is a top priority to ease the debt burden on countries, especially those who have been hit by exogenous shocks, countries with good governance, but suffering from these shocks terribly. We have made progress. We do have now the common framework delivering for Chad, for Zambia, and also countries outside of the common framework, Sri Lanka, Suriname, benefiting from bringing creditors, public and private, together. We recognize we have to accelerate that restructuring, make it predictable, timely, and providing breathing space to debtor countries through debt suspension during negotiations. This is what we have been advocating for. We now have the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable that brings, for the first time in the last decades, traditional Paris Club creditors, non-Paris Club creditors, China, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and the private sector, together with the debtor countries. And I heard this call yesterday. So President Ruto, you're here representing countries. I can turn to you and say, yes, sir, this is being done. We have to go beyond that. We have to recognize debt and climate are correlated and will be even more so. And therefore, we need to work on debt for climate swaps. The World Bank takes leadership on debt suspension clauses in their programs. At the IMF, we have an instrument called Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust that allows us to provide directly debt relief to poor countries when they're hit by shocks. We used it in the past. We used it mostly for COVID. We are determined to use it for climate shocks as well. And talking about climate, let me turn to the second area directly relevant for our work. The IMF has, over the last years, integrated climate considerations in everything we do, because climate is macro-critical. We integrate it in fiscal policy, in monetary policy, in data, and of course we also have a financial instrument. Let me stress one area where the IMF has been tirelessly promoting action, and it is on carbon price. Our analysis shows that without carbon price, there is no chance, no flying chance, that we will meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target by 2030. We will miss it. So we need to have this incentive in place. We advocate for inclusive approach that is including tax, but also trade and also regulatory actions, as long as they deliver trajectory on in the right direction, up on carbon price. We propose a carbon price floor that is fair. Poor countries pay less, middle-income countries more, rich countries, of course, they have the highest price. And then I agree with you, there is space to think of international deployment of some of these resources. We are not there yet, but there is movement. We were, just 5 years ago, covering 17% of emissions. Now we cover 25%. There is only 75% more to go. But with will, when there is will, there is way. And talking about financing, this is the third area very relevant for the IMF. We have created a new instrument, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. First time in the history of the IMF, we provide long-term, affordable financing, 20 years, repayment, 10.5-year grace. How did we fund it? We funded it with the goodwill on countries like France, and we look forward to the US contributing, that have taken part of their new SDR allocations, and per the promise made, they have made this available to the IMF to provide us affordable lending. We have reached the commitment, the pledge made in 21, the pledge of 100 billion. 60 billion of this pledge is already working at the IMF in the Poverty Reduction and Trust Fund and in the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And I can tell you it makes a difference. We issued 2 press releases here for Barbados and for Rwanda, how this money, in partnership with the World Bank Group, with the Inter-American Development Bank, with national development banks, based on analysis provided by our sister institution, how it makes a difference in accelerating the green transition, bringing more ability for countries to face the challenge, to adapt to the challenge of climate change. So we have 7 countries that have benefited. You are on the queue. Kenya is on the queue. We have 40 countries expressing interest. And because of that, I want to announce today, we are lifting up our ambition to increase by 50% the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, so we don't have to ration financing and we can respond to needs. I want to finish with the following. When I started in my job, the first thing I did was to go to the Bretton Woods in this beautiful hotel and to sit in the room, a very small room, where it all happened. Only 44 countries at that time. By the way, all delegations led by men. Most of them came by boat. Since then, the number of countries more than doubled in the world. The number of people more than tripled. And the global GDP increased more than 10 times. It is a different world. And obviously, we have to change. We have been changing as the world changes. And I completely and totally commit to changing for the future with you, with our members. And today, yesterday, we got impetus for what it means to change, to be more inclusive, more representative, well-resourced, and with serving with professionalism and empathy our members. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristalina. And now I will give the floor to Ajay Banga. Thank you, Mr. President, and welcome. I think it's a great chance for all of us to have you here now.
Thank you very much. And it's, first of all, Mr. President, I want to thank you for your engagement and your inclusivity, and I think, most importantly, your willingness and courage to take on doing something like this. You and your team deserve a lot of credit for that, so thank you. I've been 3 weeks in this job, and as President Ruto said, 3 weeks was how long it took to create the Bretton Woods, so I have a feeling I've been in the job long enough, and 3 weeks means my honeymoon is over. And it's an institution I've long admired. I knew, and I came into this job with my eyes wide open of the challenges that we'll be being asked to work on. I think the evolution roadmap is only the beginning of them. There's so much more to be done, so I get that. And I think that what changed and what changes for me is that when I'm with people who believe that our challenges are appropriate, are opportunities, and they come to the problem with some kind of infectious optimism, then I kind of feel like if we all come together, we will succeed. And to me, the biggest challenge we have is that the global south, as we call it, has more young people than any other part of the world as a percentage of their population. And let's not forget that half those people are women and girls. And therefore, in those two sets of people, women and young people, we have the possibility of our future, the dynamism and the hope of our opportunities for our children and our grandchildren. The problem is that only works if they have quality of life, as I said in a panel with you, Mr. President, when they're growing up, meaning health, education, clean air, clean water, energy, things we take for granted in this where we live. But also when they grow up, jobs. Jobs are the single best way to drive a nail into the coffin of poverty. It is the single best way. And so driving growth and driving jobs is what we have to focus on. And I think as part of redefining our mission and our vision to what Secretary Yelling was referring to, my view is that the World Bank's vision has to evolve to say, yes, we will create a world free of poverty, but on a livable planet. And a livable planet meaning we tackle climate, pandemics, fragility, unnecessary wars, things that make food security, things that reduce our ability to have quality of life and to have hope and optimism. I also believe that this vision is threatened by these intertwined crises, these exact same issues that create the challenge for livability. So I think time is of the essence. Frankly, we are at a critical time in the arc of humanity and our planet. And not having a sense of urgency about the need to scale and replicate things that work would be a travesty of justice. Even if we were to have enough money to do it well, if we don't urgently do so with scale, then we are letting down every single stakeholder in our institution. So I want to be practical on three things that we've announced here. I felt, President Macron, that you indicated you wanted tangible things. So let me cover those three over the last 24 hours. The first one is a comprehensive catastrophe toolkit, an approach that significantly expands our toolkit for crisis preparedness, for response, and for recovery. So how are we doing this? We're going to help governments build advanced emergency systems so they can be ready to respond on day one. Provide new types of insurance that will backstop development projects, allowing work to get back on track quickly. We've actually had these bonds out now in Peru and Jamaica, and the idea is to scale and replicate them to other parts of the world. To give countries new flexibility to quickly redirect a portion of their funds for emergency response so cash is immediately accessible. And offer a pause in debt repayments so countries can focus on what matters and not worry about the bill. And we're looking to embed catastrophe insurance in our lending products with the intent that those insurance premiums and interest will be covered through the generosity of others. And that would ultimately give countries recovery resources without adding to their debt, something that William has referred to now a few times over the last 2 days, appropriately so. When catastrophes occur, leaders are concerned about their people and their communities, giving them water, food, power, and they're really quite devastated by the loss of life. What they don't need at that time is a hand in the face. They need to feel the hand of people like the World Bank on their back. That is what we are trying to do. We recognize that one size does not fit all. That's why it's a comprehensive toolkit and approach, but I think this can be a big step forward. The second, which you helped me actually launch, Mr. President, was the Private Sector Investment Lab. We all know that trillions are required annually to address these challenges. And I know that development banks or even the generosity of governments and philanthropies cannot provide the resources we need. And so therefore, we need the private sector. We all say that, but the truth is our efforts over the years have now come nowhere near what we need to be showing as an output. That's why we're trying a new approach. We're trying to create this private sector investment lab, a concrete step which is designed to identify and remove the barriers preventing private investment in the emerging markets. I described it with you, Mr. President, as creating a railroad on which the private sector can run its rail cars. If we can create that railroad with standardized sort of methods, then we can do a good job with this. The lab will put an emphasis on scaling transition finance. The initial focus is renewable energy and sustainable energy infrastructure. Most importantly, and this is really important to me, the idea is to get ideas, not reports, not videos. Every month when we meet, we will receive 1 or 2 ideas from them. We will work them. If they work, that's good. If they don't, we call them a failure and move on. But over the course of a year, if we get 6 ideas that work, we win. And that's what we're trying to get to. So as you know, sir, Mark Carney and Shriti Vadera are helping to be co-chairs of this work. They're going to announce a whole composition of the group in the coming couple of weeks. I'm very grateful to both of them for taking this on. And then the last part is our climate outcome measurement. As many of you know, we've been telling part of the climate story. We focus on how many dollars we put in, not what we are getting out. So that's why what we're doing now is to kick off a new initiative with other multilateral development institutions to reimagine a way to track climate outcomes, one that pivots from mostly measuring the volume of dollars spent on climate to actually primarily measuring the impact of our financing, greenhouse gases reduced, cleaner water provided, and so on. The ultimate goal is to launch a new climate outcome platform later this year at COP28. But that work started here in Paris yesterday at the Finance in Common meeting, again chaired by you. We have a lot of work to do. These are just 3 roadmarks along the way. I'm very conscious of immediate issues like the debt crisis. Kristalina and Secretary Yellen spoke to it. I think progress with Zambia is excellent. The challenge is we've got a whole lot of others to work on, and we need to get that sense of urgency into it. I'm very grateful for the opportunity, sir, to be here for my first meeting of this type, and for you to give me a platform, but even more importantly, for the hand I feel on my back from you as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ajay. Merci beaucoup. Pour conclure, ces 2 jours de travaux nous ont permis en effet d'avancer sur un agenda nourri et de bâtir ainsi un
serious advances on a very full agenda and to come to a consensus for the peoples of our planet. I spelled out that consensus earlier and tried to give a fairly full rendition of that at the end.
I'm going to repeat this here. We're going to ask all delegations to endorse it in terms that are intelligible to one and all, not technical language. It's not going to be a communique like the G7 or the G20, but a common approach, a number of actions mentioned today that are finalized, the new roadmap and coordination mechanisms between the bank and the IMF, major milestones, also set of goals with meetings very tangibly requested that will mark the road towards a deeper, better governance of our international financial architecture. The aim is to have the Paris consensus for the people of the planet that we endorsed yesterday and today, and to follow the work, we'll have a permanent follow-up mechanism in 2 years' time to report on it through a summit on the results and outcomes on the basis of what we've launched. And that's why, with the current and future G20 chairs, to structure the work of G7 and G20 going forward, and that's also why several distinguished members were in attendance. My thanks to Secretary Yellen once again for her involvement, the good discussions conducted with what's underway in Washington. You'll have understood these are not just mere words, they're tangible responses, a follow-up mechanism, and a meeting at least in 2 years' time with major milestones and in-depth change. This mechanism is set once again to broadly include, as President Erta recalled, it's our goal with all governments, but also with civilian populations. Just 2 comments and thanks. Firstly, the strength of this summit was to bring together over 40 heads of state and government, G7 countries, major emerging countries, poorest countries, those newly affected by climate change and who've experienced the vulnerability coming from all regions of the world. It's a very free and wide-ranging discussion at plenary this morning, dinner last night with criticism leveled, but I think it's the condition to forge a united response. What's clear, and I say this very clear-sightedly and with gravity, inequality. I'd say that through its very method, this summit is set to forge the unity of the international community behind these challenges, fight against inequality, and fight to preserve the planet. If we fail, without a doubt, we'll see a fragmentation of our international institutions. Those that exist will be gradually delegitimized by the poorest and emerging and by more or less praiseworthy intentions of those who have the money and can help them. So our responsibility is to maintain this unity, serving our principles and the common good that we've redefined. And lastly, I'd like to thank all those who have made this summit possible. Of course, the heads of state and government, Secretary General, my personal representative, as well as their teams, the Élysée teams who were heavily mobilized, but also the ministers present and their teams, as well as their departments, the Quai d'Orsay and Bercy, who contributed significantly to drafting all the text, as well as the French Development Agency and several other entities. I'd like to thank the Paris Peace Forum and its teams that contributed extensively, and all NGOs, as well as representatives of civil society. We've pledged and we delivered 50% of delegations and invited delegates should come from all continents, but above all civil society. My thanks to all NGOs who made that possible, who rallied, representatives of civil society, of the youth, and we had a representative speak yesterday who contributed to the platform through the Secretary General, and over time they'll be involved in the follow-up mechanism. I'll stop there, and let's take the three questions that planned. Thank you. Question from the French press, one from the US and Kenyan press for the French press. First question.
Bonjour à toutes et tous. Christelle Méral, France
Hello.
Télévisions.
France Television. First question to the French and Kenyan presidents. How can this summit convince countries of the South to commit more against Russia and the war in Ukraine? International tax on shipping, discussed at great length ahead of the summit. President Macron seems that little progress made on that front. Why is there no consensus emerging, and that does call into question that tax? And lastly, Madam Secretary Yellen, why the US are not in favor of that tax? Thank you. To be very frank, the purpose of this summit wasn't to convince countries who might have had doubts or other to rally more differently on Ukraine. And if that were our approach, it'd be the best way of nurturing mistrust. An African initiative led that we discussed. Several heads of state in attendance expressed their conclusions both on Russia and Ukraine. I think the purpose is specifically to continue to forge geopolitical unity that can be threatened by direct and indirect consequences of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, preserve the unity of all countries in the planet, emerging, developing the riches that we're still focusing on war, very much upmost in our agenda, but mustn't reduce our collective commitment to serve the commons that are at the heart of our international agenda: climate, biodiversity, fighting inequalities, promoting education, health. So this summit was highly relevant in that respect, and I think all these issues, they can only be resolved with the full international community, China, US, major emerging powers, G7, G20, but also developing and poorest countries. It's the purpose and usefulness of this summit. As to tax, I'm in favor of an international tax funding the efforts we need to undertake in fighting poverty and the climate. I recalled France applied on itself two previously proposed taxes on airline tickets and on financial transactions. You'll agree with me that an international tax is international when it's adopted by all, and there are international taxes like socialism formally. It doesn't work in just one country. And so we're already at the technological front. We're not going to continue to beat ourselves alone. We're going to try and rally and get others to follow. So we're in favor of an international tax on shipping because it's a sector that's not taxed. There's no reason why it's not taxed and doesn't contribute to efforts throughout the world. So I think it's a very good cause. The goal here was to continue to rally people. We have a club of those who are like-minded, and it's to the IMO, International Maritime Organization, to negotiate. We'll have that. We defend a tax that can be very modest to begin with. It's a sector that is decarbonizing it. We're encouraging that, but it's justified. Revenues generated, sometimes considerable, should be taxed. But for it to work, we have to do what we did on the minimum international tax, to have a set of countries that follow suit. I'll be clear, if China, the US, several European countries that also have large shipping companies involved don't follow us, well, you're putting a tax in place, but it has no effects because people are going to be taxed will head to countries that aren't taxed. So key countries must rally. Will continue in that direction. The July meeting at the IMO will be conclusive, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think
Welcome back to the newsroom. We've been watching the final press conference of this two-day climate and finance summit organized by the French President Emmanuel Macron. In attendance were high-ranking delegations from the West, Africa, and China. World leaders releasing a to-do list to help developing countries better tackle climate change and poverty. This amid calls for the global financial system to evolve, developing countries bearing the brunt of climate change, poverty, instability, pandemics, and conflict.